I'm interested in the culture of medicalization that has convinced people that pharma is the solution to a lot of their issues.
Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. Dr. Ingrid Walker is a cultural studies scholar, a writer, and a professor. Her studies and her activism works towards changing public attitudes about people who use drugs. She wants to break us out of the criminalization versus medicalization paradigm and expand our vocabulary so we can speak openly and meaningfully about the whole range of intoxicated experiences. Why do people feel comfortable talking about their Xanax or Adderall use, but not cocaine or crystal meth? Why can hungover employees brag about their drunken escapades the next morning, while somebody else's clear-eyed story of a mind-expanding trip might be met with awkward cringing? How does the war on drugs and the work of pharmaceutical companies contribute to these attitudes? Dr. Walker has been studying this problem, and today she talks about the historical causes and the paths towards a solution. If you want to live in a world where adults can talk clearly and honestly about drugs, then I know you'll enjoy this conversation with Dr. Ingrid Walker. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today with Dr. Ingrid Walker. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
When you were little, did you guess that you'd be writing books and giving TED Talks about drugs?
No, I didn't even guess that in graduate school. It's a second field for me. But I was around a lot of drug use as a kid, and I think that makes a really big difference.
How so? And what interested you in the beginning of all this?
So I started this project a million years ago in 2002 when I was watching the Super Bowl ad gallery at the halftime, which I'm not a football fan, but I teach popular culture, so I always watch the ad gallery. And there was this quick 15-second spot that just blew my mind, and it was a freckled-faced boy, maybe 12, his whole face on a black screen, and he's talking really quickly, and he says, "I killed mothers, I killed fathers, I killed grandmothers, I killed grandfathers, I killed firemen, I killed policemen." And then he says, "Well, I didn't really kill them, I just sort of helped." And the title card said, "If you buy drugs, you engage in terrorism." And this is 4 months after 9/11, and I was like, what? And this was to the biggest television audience of the year. And so I spent the next year chasing down the people who created the ad and figuring out what was behind it, and really kind of digging deep into the money of the drug war, which I was already quite familiar with, but getting kind of pissed off about the way drug users are being represented.
And what did you find out about specifically on the money side of that ad?
So the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or the home of the drug czar, is the group that put the money up behind the ad, and it was done by Ogilvy and Mather, which is one of the hot ad firms, and still is. And they paid a ridiculous amount of money for it. In fact, later it came up before Congress. They paid $1.5 million for a 15-second spot, which doesn't sound like a lot now, but in 2002 it was an exorbitant amount of money, especially for a PSA. But what I realized was it was just part of a much longer and broader campaign, media campaign that Congress had authorized in 1998, aimed at youth mostly, and they were spending billions of dollars on this bad advertising.
And so what did you learn about those early days of the drug spending?
Well, one of the things that I think concerned me the most about it was that I didn't know who the ONDCP was, and I realized a lot, and then later I started hearing that acronym on NPR advertising in all kinds of places, and I realized, a lot of this money was being spent on ads to do what I in my book call change hearts and minds. And the thing about the drug war is that most people don't really know anything about it. Like, they think they do. They're like, oh, lots of people are in prison, or black and brown people are disproportionately stopped and convicted. But they don't really understand how it was waged. But I spent my middle school and high school years in Humboldt County, California in the 70s. And I know how it's waged because it was waged there with vengeance. And so once I realized, oh, this is really just a way of kind of whitewashing the drug war and making it sort of, an acronym and something even, lefty liberals who are listening to NPR can get behind, I got really concerned about hearts and minds and thinking we need to unpack this a little bit.
And so up in Humboldt, you would have been seeing the camp raids.
That's right.
Can
Up
you
close
talk
and personal.
Can you talk about what those are and how they're affecting the locals?
Yeah, so Ronald Reagan, when he was president, authorized this very targeted episode of the drug war to really come down on marijuana production in the Emerald Triangle of Northern California. And where we lived in southern Humboldt County, there were, sometimes like 15 to 20 sorties a day. It was like being in a war. It was like being in a war zone. I mean, there were planes and helicopters overhead all the time because at that time most people were growing outdoors. And the thing about Humboldt County, it was a logging community for a long time until it got logged out, and then everybody lost their jobs. And so marijuana production in the 60s and 70s became the second economy. And so a lot of people were involved in it. People's grandmothers were manicuring buds, and it was a lot of people touched this industry. It wasn't just, disaffected people from California who moved north to sort of, go off the grid. It was a lot of different kinds of local people. And so the campaign against marijuana production was really kind of an intense experience because people, if plants are found on your land, you forfeited as asset seizure, you forfeited everything. And so it was a way of harassing people of the community to turn people in, to point out places where they could go find farms, and they were under a lot of national pressure to have results.
One of the things that happened during the camp raids was that a federal judge put a huge restriction on how they had to operate. And then I believe it just got simply ignored, and the raids went on just as they did before.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Bear in mind, I was a 13-year-old kid at the time, So, but what was interesting about being on the ground while all this is going on is it caused a lot of anger and frustration at the war on drugs. And so one of the things I think that we don't represent very well when we talk about histories of the drug war or histories of people who are affected by it is the variety of communities who have been affected by the drug war. We tend to think of the sort of crackdown on crack in the 1980s as a main facet of the drug war, but I think the precursor to it was definitely camp. And it affected so many people, so if you lose everything, and you're up in a rural place and you're already living pretty close to the poverty line, it really hit the community hard. And the no-knock warrants and the busting in on people and kind of harassing them from the air was kind of a common occurrence.
Wow. And so that's where you got some of your first sympathies for the acronym that's became more popular, PWUD, people who use drugs.
Yeah, and I was a person who used drugs, and my parents were people who used drugs. Largely they used, marijuana and hallucinogens on occasion. But as I grew older, I used all kinds of drugs. And I think one of the things my book does, and one of the things I very much want to shift culturally, is our understanding of who it is that uses drugs. Because we spend so much time and attention in popular culture and media focusing on people at an extreme end of the spectrum, and for good reason. People who suffer with addiction, people who are struggling with their drug use. But that's just 10% or less of the population of drug users, right? So there's all these other drug users we're not thinking about most of the time. So people who use drugs is a really complex set of people, and it's not who we think about. So yeah, my sympathies are with them because I'm one of them, and I know lots of people, who use drugs of all different sorts and with all different sorts of results, and I think that's something that's the silencing of people who use drugs has allowed this to go on for so long.
And that's actually one of the things that really impressed me when I saw you speaking at the National Harm Reduction Conference is right up front, as an academic, you said, I am someone who uses drugs. And that's just not something you see out there. What's it like for you to be someone who's so out there about consuming substances?
It's funny. I expected there to be a big backlash. I first kind of outed myself because, people know me as a drug user who know me, and I've moved all over the country. But I thought when I have a TED Talk, and when I outed myself as a meth user, I thought, okay, here it comes. And then there was nothing. It was just silence. And I was like, oh. And when I published the book, I sent it up to the chain of lawyers, at the university, and there's crickets. And I realized, people want plausible deniability, but I actually think I get a lot passed because I'm white, I'm middle class, and I'm a professional, and I should leverage that privilege to point out that there's all kinds of drug users. Because I think culture change, I'm a cultural studies scholar, and culture changes because people become accustomed to something, and they become acquainted and then accustomed to something. So if you think about LGBTQ issues, for the longest time, we were such a blatantly homophobic culture, and then people started to realize they knew all kinds of gay people and all kinds of bi people and trans people, and I can't believe how fast that has shifted. As people came out of the closet and said, "I'm gay too. Hey, look, I'm in your family." People's perception changed. So for me, it's important to be out as a drug user because I can leverage my privilege, my considerable cultural privilege. But it's also important because people think about drug users as two kinds: people who use light drugs, and I'm going to say here marijuana, right? And, sort of maybe the occasional ecstasy or shrooms at a concert. And then there's everybody else. And I'm like, that's a false binary. And a lot of us use all the drugs, have used all the drugs on and off throughout our lives, and don't look like what you picture a drug user to be like.
And that's one of the powerful parts about the book you created, is the focus on stories. And I was curious how you went about gathering all the different stories that you have there.
So it took me forever to write this book because I started it in the early aughts, and then left academia for 7 years, and then came back and as an administrator, and finally decided to write the book. So it took a really long time off and on thinking about it. And I collected those stories all along. I have a lot more. My press would only allow a dozen, but I actually originally wanted to do a book that was just narratives of people who use drugs. And nobody was really interested in that in the early aughts. So I kind of shoehorned it into my academic book because I said, you shouldn't take my point of view for this. I wanted to get a variety of voices who use different kinds of drugs with different kinds of experiences. Some of them do suffer with addiction. Some of them have, but then found something else they could use. Some of them, surprisingly, really had more problems with pharmaceutical drugs than they did with street drugs, right? So, I think it complicates our really oversimplified understanding of drug use.
And one quick aside, where did you run away to for 7 years?
I ran away with a circus, and I maybe should have stayed, but I'm back. I did all kinds of things. I just got really burned out. My Twitter handle is bad academic because I'm not a natural for this world, and I never have been, and I have fantasies about running away all the time. So, that is what it is. So I did all kinds of things. I sold running shoes. I did accreditation for universities. I made art. And I thought about this book.
And so what's it been like to come back to academia with a focus more on the fringe like this?
Yeah, it's been really great. And I have to say that my happiest discovery, and you and I met at the harm reduction conference, my happiest discovery has been all these different populations of people who care about and work with people who use drugs, not just people who are in crisis, but all across different spectra of drug use. And it's been really kind of confirming, and the timing is rather interesting because when I first came back 9 years ago, I was still getting the no from academic presses. They weren't sure they wanted to say yes to drugs. And next thing I knew, there were 27 states or however many there are now who have legalized marijuana. And it's like suddenly there's this tide of people going, oh yeah, we're already all using this. We might as well just say yes and get the tax revenue. And I think one of the biggest problems of right now culturally is this divide we have between thinking that marijuana is one thing, but let's say opiates or stimulants are something else. And I'm like, if drugs were regulated, the overdose crisis would largely go away. People weren't dying from poison drugs. And so coming back to the fringes has allowed me, kind of emboldened me to just say what I think and discover other people who do the same. And it's been really great.
And what kind of communities come to mind as ones that you didn't know were out there in regards to drugs, or were more robust than you would have guessed?
Well, definitely the harm reduction crowd is huge, loud and proud. But so as I've gone around to different kinds of, so I've worked with policy people, and I've worked with researchers who are in the National Institutes of Health and Medicine, and I've worked with and met with people who are working more embedded in organizations, nonprofits. And what interests me is how there's this through line for all of us about how we really care about the social justice of drug use, and how our laws and public health policies adversely impact people. So I think I'm really surprised by the activism that just cuts across all those fields.
You write about how the medicalization of these things is often an invisible partner to the criminalization. Can you talk more about that and how that works in this country?
Yeah, I think it's what's gotten us to this horrific point in the opioid crisis, but I would just at this point call it the fentanyl crisis. So I would say that most of us do not feel comfortable going into our healthcare providers and saying, I'm a drug user and here are the drugs that I use. And so there's a silencing or chilling effect on the one hand, just in terms of what healthcare professionals know people use, unless those people are in crisis with drug use, suffering with addiction, sort of repeat offenders needing, different kinds of healthcare interventions based on their extreme drug use. And so medicalization, on the one hand, sees only extreme street drug use. On the other hand, medicalization, is this great authority for pro-drug use, right? And, pharma, only recently is it coming out how problematic pharma is and how overburdened the FDA is and how limited our regulation and understanding really of what drugs are and what they do is. And one of the things I do in that chapter is trace back to a point when we made a concerted effort culturally to buy into psychotherapeutic drugs. And although they've been around since the 20s and 30s, and there's this great book called Happy Pills by my colleague David Herzberg, kind of traces the early blockbuster drugs, I'm interested in the culture of medicalization that has convinced people that pharma is the solution to a lot of their issues. So in the 50s and 60s, psychiatry realized it was losing market share to physicians who are producing chemical solutions to people's problems. And so the APA literally made a concerted effort to say, we are going to now make prescribing drug use our front line, not years of psychoanalysis. And so that turn culturally in the 50s and 60s is one we've really embraced. And the escalation of people on psychotherapeutic drugs is astronomical. And so what's happened is, even as we're waging this drug war, we're saying yes to drugs, other kinds of drugs, and we're not realizing they're the same drugs. So, in my TED Talk, I make it really easy. Most people now know that, Adderall and Ritalin are amphetamines, or, amphetamine-like drugs. And we have this war on methamphetamine, but we're giving our kids Adderall, right? And so we don't even realize what the drugs we're doing are, because medicalization has convinced us that the medical authority lies elsewhere and we shouldn't ask questions and we'll just take these drugs to solve our problems.
I'm curious about the reaction of the FDA people that you meet to you.
I'm going to guess, I've only met one and he was too polite to say anything to me, but I'm going to guess that they know. They must be frustrated because they cannot review most of the cases that come before them. And you've got this, I think it was Marcia Angel wrote this book where she talked about the industry, about the pharmaceutical industry, and the ways in which they take a drug that has sold really well, and the minute they're about ready to use the patent on it, they take it off the market and add one thing and remarket it as something else. And because this is the strategy, very few pharmaceutical companies are doing new R&D. Most of them are just repurposing successful components of drugs as something else. And because of that, the FDA is just really wiped out, and it's been such a successful industry that they can't possibly have the oversight that they're supposed to have. My guess is they would say, yeah, you're right, we need 5 times as many people.
That's a very fair answer. It does seem like it's scientists there trying to get the job done. I know Rick Doblin always speaks well of the FDA and trying to get MDMA in as a prescription medication, and they're really following the science, which is something hopeful to hear.
Right, I know.
And so you talk about developing a language with which to talk about drug use outside of these frameworks of being medical or criminal. And how do you go about that, and what does it look like?
It's interesting you mentioned Rick Doblin, because I think the new psychedelic frontier has opened up possibility of rethinking how we engage drugs, right? So psychedelics are they're so complex. They don't just do one thing, right? So for you could be with 10 people and you all take, a hit of acid, and everybody has a completely different experience, right? So it's and I think that's true of all drugs, but I think we tend to oversimplify. But because the psychedelic frontier is happening right now in psychotherapy, I'm kind of concerned that even the drugs with which we are addressing really important problems like PTSD are going to become medicalized on the one hand, so only accessible through medical authority, but also we're going to start to think of them as, oh, that's the drug you solve this problem with. And when I think about the ways in which, the people I know who use drugs talk about drugs, they have a lush vocabulary, a really complex vocabulary. It's sort of like standing around listening to wine people, the way they talk about wines. But because the people who use drugs' voices have not been the people talking to the mainstream culture, our vocabulary is really stunted. And it's stunted in the service of criminalization and medicalization, right? So drugs are, as historian Nancy Campbell says, either problem solving or problem causing. And most, you go to you go to Burning Man, you go somewhere and people are using a variety of drugs in a variety of different ways. And their conversation is going to be very different, but not even just Burning Man. I'm thinking, so I live in Washington State, where marijuana has been legal now for several years as a recreational. I don't like that term. I'm making air quotes, but you can't see me. and it's so fascinating going into my local shop, which I really like. I live near a really great one, and it has high volume. So sometimes I'll just sit there and watch who comes in. And I'm writing a piece right now about the normalization of cannabis use. And I think it's pretty fascinating to see how quickly people pivot between issues of pleasure and issues of other kinds of needs, right? So somebody might come in and really be looking for some kick-ass THC, heavy flower. Same time, they're like, what do you got in CBD oil? And I think in that milieu, we've realized, there's a variety of applications for this substance. And historically, through millennia, people have used it a bunch of different ways. And now we get to embrace that because we have this quote unquote recreational market that's not just medical, right? But for the most part, people are going in there and they're getting heavy hitting flower. I'm just like, oh my God, I'd be unconscious if I smoked that, So they're enjoying their high. And I think that's something that we now can embrace in states where legalization has a track record. But it's really uncomfortable to say to people, like you can't say to somebody, I got some great cocaine last night. I was out of my mind. It was so fun. People just cringe when you say that, right? And I think why? Like, why is that any different than the cannabis or anything else? And the why is because of the way we've been taught to think about that drug.
So what would you prescribe moving forward for a saner relationship to drugs for this country?
I wish, my fantasy, when I see how... and granted, Washington State hasn't done any longitudinal data on this yet, but when I see how the legal market has been embraced by just about everybody who is in the black market, so it's not just for rich white people or people of means. When I see that, I think, what would it be like if everything that people wanted to use was available to them and they knew it was unadulterated, right? So it's kind of like going and getting a 6-pack of beer. There's no poison in that beer. What would it be like for anybody who wanted to use any drug if they knew that? That's like a threshold of safety that I think is really critical. But so, that requires legalization and regulation and creating markets for it. But I think those markets already exist. Right now, people are buying things through the internet, right? And that's somewhat better than the black market because at least you can read reviews on something. But we're also in a crisis where people are putting weird chemicals in drugs that don't usually have them in them, and they're dying because of this. So that's a public health threshold. But I think the prescription for me for like thinking about how do we change our relationships to drugs is embracing that intoxication is a multifaceted set of experiences. And because most people only drink, they think, drug use is like getting drunk. And it's like, not really. Most drug use is nothing like getting drunk, actually, And so if people began to have more of a vocabulary and they could try things and they could have healthcare providers be aware that they're using. I heard a panel at the Drug Policy Reform Conference several times ago about the Silk Road, the original Silk Road market online. And there was a doctor there. He was called Dr. X, and I can't remember his real name now. But for years, he provided harm reduction. He just would go online and have a forum on the Silk Road and answer people's questions. And so people would say, I'm an epileptic, and I'm thinking about using Molly, or I used smack this time, and I'm having these weird symptoms. And and he would give them advice that would help them stay healthy and safe in their pursuit of whatever they were pursuing, whatever state of mind. And I remember thinking, what a radical idea. Like, so the guy who was having weird symptoms after using heroin, it turns out the guy said, you need to go see an oncologist, and he rightly suspected he had cancer. Had nothing to do with the drug, right? So it's like, there's all these ways in which we use drugs and they affect our lives that we can't talk about. And so I think we need to unsilence drug use, and I think we need to decriminalize it, and I think we need to make things available that are not poisoned. And I think then the vocabulary will follow with which people talk about how they apply those substances to their lives.
That's a big wish, but it sounds...
That girl's got a dream.
Amen. And that's what we want to hear. The dreams are where we can eventually get to. Because the other hard part of the thing that you write about that seems like a wish for this country is talking about drugs and pleasure. And pleasure being a good thing, apparently, in a Protestant, waspy environment.
Well, think about the places we do talk about pleasure. So I think what got me on this kick a long time ago was I don't drink alcohol very much because I don't feel very good after I drink alcohol. It just feels like an absolute poison to my system. And I would drink it more if it felt good, but it's sort of, prohibitive because the next day I'm like, bleh, I don't feel good. Even if I have one drink. But I go around, into public, to dinner or wherever, and the first thing they ask you is, what do you want to drink? And you can't get them to answer a question about your food, but they'll give you 4 drinks before you order, right? So alcohol is really prevalent. I would say it's somewhat pushed because it's where people make money in the restaurant industry. And a lot of people go out and drink pretty regularly. 50% of Americans admit to going to work hungover, right? So it's a common thing that people do. So people get their pleasure on a lot when it comes to alcohol, or maybe it's not even pleasure. Maybe it's just sort of taking the edge off a bad day, or maybe it's celebrating something, right? But we know that we watch and talk about pleasure all the time. I'm in wine country, on the left coast, and people are just like, they'll go on for hours about wine, right? And so we spend a lot of time talking about pleasure or what gives us pleasure in some legalized contexts. But the ones that we have decided we shouldn't talk about are verboten. My students talk about pharmaceutical drugs with pleasure. I mean, they talk about, because they don't use them simply the way that they are prescribed, right? They're using them, they're repurposing them in different ways, and they are much more trusting of pharmaceutical drugs than my generation is. And so that's where they go for party time. And it's pretty fascinating to hear them talk about those drugs with pleasure. And I think if your doctors only could hear you right now, So I think we do have a language of pleasure in places that we think it's okay.
And speaking of your students, what's it like to be connected to people that are really doing these things and have kind of a lifeline to the reality of drug use on the ground?
Well, I teach at a university where that's less so than it might be at other places. So the University of Washington, Tacoma is a school that is a commuter school largely. And we serve students mostly who are first generation or children of immigrants or immigrants themselves or veterans. And so fewer of my students do drugs than maybe on a residential campus and students of other sorts. I think my students have much more at risk. That said, sometimes, I teach a class called Drugs in U.S. Culture, and we're talking about rave culture and the dance scene. And drugs as being part of that dance scene. And some of the students who are DJs and go to raves quite a lot were like, absolutely. And other people go to raves a lot were like, no, it's not. And I thought that's really interesting, And so there's so many people at a rave that you could be with people who are doing drugs and you can be with people who aren't doing drugs and think that's what everybody's doing. And it made me laugh, But I think, for the most part, my students are not doing as many illicit drugs. They're doing a hell of a lot of pharmaceutical drugs. And they don't even think of those as drugs, which I think is maybe the biggest public service of my class.
And speaking of that class, I'm a little bit amazed. So that class number for that is 420?
Yeah.
Did you arrange that, or did you just...
No, we did. We, American Studies faculty, we were sitting around and designing our upper level classes because we retooled the major. And we were taking numbers, and everybody looked at me and they go, you have to take 420. I was like, okay.
God bless Washington. And so, for that class, I'd be curious, what are some of your favorite books that you assign for studying drugs in U.S. culture?
Oh, actually, because we have a 10-week quarter, I don't get to assign too many full books. We use a bunch of different readings and films and TED Talks and things like that. God, there's so many things I love. There's this chapter, I'm blanking right now on the name of the, I think there's this really cheesy name of the textbook that I have them by. It's called The American Drug Scene, which is a terrible name. But the intro chapter of it blows their minds because it's about the history of drugs in the United States, starting with opium. And then, so it's like opium, morphine, heroin, cocaine, and it's this history of drugs from the 19th century. And what they're so stunned by is how each one was embraced as a solution to the previous one. Like doctors like, this is going to cure everybody, this cocaine is going to get everybody off of morphine. And that medical mindset just is really clear very early on, in our use of different kinds of substances before we even had an FDA or regulation of drugs or the Controlled Substances Act. So I think that kind of blows their mind that this is a mindset we have, that there are problem-solving drugs. Meanwhile, people didn't have water, so they were drinking ale 3 times a day, right? So alcoholism was rampant because there was just so much alcohol being used all day long. I think their attitudes shift when they think that. There's an article by Ismail Ali and Magali Lerman, and they write about the colonization of the drug war, and they set it more historically and globally, which I think is really, again, important for my students, this idea that, all of their left politics about, decolonization really have their roots in the drug war. And because our class is largely looking at the U.S., we kind of just send trajectories out to South America and Latin America and other places.
And so as someone who studies the history of culture in this country, what's it been like to look at the shift of drugs, both in your lifetime as you watch it from the early camp days, but also to study it since the beginning of the war on drugs and to see this seismic shift that's happened since the early 60s?
It's kind of amazing. The first time I went and lived abroad for a little while, I was not sure, what the cultural practices were on drug use. I was in the UK, and I knew the drug laws. I'd looked them up, but I just thought it's weird to be in a place where I don't know how to be with this, because as a drug user of illicit drugs, you learn to hide it, you learn to how to be covert in a way that doesn't seem weird, and so in a weird way, I think looking at the United States from where I am now in this vantage point, I never could have anticipated this, but it makes logical sense because the way that drugs have become available, that used to be illicit, right? So drugs like cannabis, and I'm going to say psychedelics because we're on the cusp of those becoming part of psychological therapeutic possibility or a set of options. Both of those have come through the kind of cultural practices and systems that you would expect. So the commodification of cannabis is off the hook. I mean, there's just not language. They're not superlatives enough to explain the explosion of this drug in the legal market. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Canada, because I think they're a little less. Their capitalism is much less ravenous, but the rapacious capitalism of the United States has turned its energy on cannabis. And so when I go to my store, there are all these products, and they're super expensive, and they're flashy, and they have funny names and colors, and it's really overwhelming, to me, because I think, wow, this is great. I love having all these products, but it's complete bullshit, because some of this, you look at like what's claimed versus what's actually there, and you think, oh, the worst of capitalism is manifesting itself sometimes in the legal cannabis market. Similarly, so we have this rapacious capitalism, but on the other hand, we have medicalization, which is how psychedelics are becoming reintroduced to us culturally. I asked Rick Doblin a question. We were at a symposium this time last year about psychedelic medicine and end of life. And I'm famous for being at that symposium. I was kind of new to all the legal scholars there, and I was on the last panel, and I said, this has been such an interesting day, and I'm really excited about hearing all the recent research, because actually it was 2 years ago, I realized. And, so it was, we hadn't heard as much about what MAPS, how far they'd gotten in other groups. And what I said was, I can't imagine why you would wait to the end of somebody's life to give them this experience. Like, why wait till then? Like, why can't everybody have this experience as they're coming of age? And when I interviewed Michael Pollan last year, he said to me, drugs are wasted on the young, and he meant psychedelics. And I was like, what are you talking about? Just because you waited till you were in your 60s to use them doesn't mean, that people who are younger don't have meaningful, life-changing experiences with them. They're a big part of who they are. But I think the medicalization of psychedelics concerns me because, will people think then that that's what that drug is for? And I think people like Ismail Ali and others are doing a great job of reminding us the plants are coming from the jungle for us. And this is just one part of what's going on. We're in a moment of deep cultural pathology. People are angry and upset and divided, and maybe the plants are a way of opening to other possibilities, But I think culturally, we have to get past this place right now where we have done just what is typical to us, which is to monetize things and or to medicalize them.
That's a great set of thoughts to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and thank you so much for all of your work in this field. We'll be linking to your book and the TED Talk in the episode notes, as well as your research.
Thanks for what you're doing, Lex. I think it's a really great podcast. All right, bye-bye.
Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more, with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.